Welcome, Postmodern Theologies cohorts. My Respondent video assignment was to examine the readings for week 10. They were What is Intersectionality, Chapter 1 in Intersectionality by Sima Bilge, and Power in Global Perspective, Feminist Reflections in Chapter 8 of Religion, Theology, and Class by Pamela K. Brubaker. I'd like to begin by stating that I thoroughly enjoyed these readings. They were extremely relevant and in many ways complementary because the key points of both essays were, first, how intersectionality can be used as a tool to analyze power inequalities, and two, how the feminist perspective helps to frame those power inequalities as a function of class, power, race, and economics. The two readings were also quite relevant to the moment we find ourselves in because a global pandemic has come upon world governments, and it's found them woefully unprepared in most part because a long period of wealth distribution towards the top 10 percentile of people has ensured that the bottom 90% increasingly struggle to adequately provide for themselves and their families the basic necessities of housing, clothing, education, and healthcare. So let's jump into this analysis and take a look at the key points of the readings. Because they were so similar, I will leap back and forth between them until I later explain their differences. So in intersectionality, Bilge starts out at the beginning of her chapter by providing a general description of intersectionality. In that description, social inequality figures prominently. She writes, "When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis of social division, be it race or gender or class, but by many axes that work together and influence each other," end quote. Of course, Brubaker's chapter is all about inequalities. Her article starts, or rather chapter, starts with a description of the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in 2012. And what dominated that meeting was the, quote, "growing inequality between the planet's haves and have-nots," end of quote. Bilge, under Domains of Power, demonstrated three uses of intersectionality as an analytical tool by describing what she calls domains of power. Bilge first related the story of Brazil's 2014 FIFA World Cup as a case study of how the games pitted the government's desire to be seen as a relevant world power and gain much-needed revenue against the population's desire for badly needed social and infrastructure reforms. Bilge used that story to describe four interconnected domains of power: interpersonal, disciplinary, cultural, and structural. Brubaker framed power more as the systematic use of the imbalance of economic and political leverage by the, quote, 1 percentile, end quote, to maintain their power. Brubaker borrowed Susan George's description of this 1 percentile as the masters of mankind, who she calls the Davos class. She painted a chilling portrait of them when she wrote, quote, "They run our major institutions, including the media, know exactly what they want, and are much more united and better organized than the rest of us. Although individually they may be moral, kind-hearted bankers, generous traders, and socially responsible CEOs, she charges that because they serve a single system, the Davos class, they are predatory," end quote. Of course, Brubaker's main point is all about the impact of the United States on global income and wealth distribution. Her emphasis is on the global perspective, and she's examined this problem in terms of governmental policies that support social and economic disparities. Bilge examined wealth distribution primarily from the perspective of how the global neoliberalistic economic policies have created a system of wealth distribution that, quote, does not fall equally on everyone, end quote. The methods used by both authors were somewhat different. Bilge used what she called core ideals or ideas of intersectional frameworks, and she used 3 cases to highlight what she wrote were the complexity of people's lives within an equally complex social context. The 3 cases, the FIFA World Cup, the global social inequality problem, and the Black Brazilian feminist social movement, all worked to clarify what she called the 6 core ideas that she used intersectionality as an analytical tool for. The methods that she used for her intersectional frameworks: inequality, relationality, power, social context, complexity, and social justice. Brubaker's method was to more narrowly examine the global aspects of inequality, class, and power from a feminist perspective. And her discussion of the consequences of neoliberalism on world economies was especially effective. For example, her linkage of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign in late 1967 to the recent Occupy movement really drew a bright line between the two. And essentially, Brubaker's method was to examine power differentials as a means of primary analysis. She defined the following approaches to answering the questions of class and power through an analysis of 3 economies. One was market, sustenance, the second one, and the third one, nature. And then she deconstructed the exercise of power on each market through national and global institutions, policies, and practices. How the authors engaged in the key topics we've examined in the class concerning power, race, sex, and so on was basically revealed in the approaches and methods they used. Both engaged the following topics, but from different perspectives, as shown in this table. There are several things to note about how the 2 authors engaged the key topics. First of all, Bilge specifically addressed relationality, social context, and complexity through storytelling and case studies in her engagement style, while Brubaker's engagement style was more statistical and analytical. As far as similarities and differences are concerned, here you can see in this table I put up, the general impression I got was that both authors had somewhat similar styles in terms of readability, personal context, and even how they engaged the topics. And this is why I modified that key topics engagement table I showed previously, to provide an analysis of similarities and differences. And as you can see, the main points of social inequalities, power, race, gender, capitalism, wealth distribution, and class were very similar. Again, with the different perspectives of Brubaker's feminism and Bilge's intersectionality. That said, Brubaker departs rather starkly from Bilge in discussions of social justice, economies, and globalization. I found both articles to be tremendously helpful. As I said in the beginning, I enjoyed reading both very much. Some of the more theoretical readings we've done in the class having to do with postmodernism and its derivatives were a bit challenging for me because I found a lot to disagree with, especially as they relate to science and rationality. I've been somewhat vocal about that. But in these readings, I found solid, practical analysis of real-world issues that were, frankly, like a breath of fresh air to me. Nothing was surprising. Both really did enhance their prior readings and our prior readings, and both were very good examples of how to analyze events and social structures from the intersectionality and feminist lenses. Bilge's intersectionality provided a strong rationale for using intersectionality as a tool for analyzing social complexities. General weakness in her writing is the long stretches between points she wanted to make. These points are always demarked by the use of the words firstly, secondly, thirdly, and so on, but there was always so much writing between the points that the material should have, I thought, been arranged as subsections. It would have been a lot easier to read that way. Also, I believe she did not really support her core intersectional frameworks of relationality, social context, and complexity very well, except as kind of analytical caveats at the end of her chapter. Yeah, I would have liked to have seen a more explicit treatment of those frameworks in the main text of the chapter. It would have made it longer, but I think it would have really enhanced that. So Brubaker's chapter provided a good overview of the topic from a feminist perspective. And although she did claim to be a, quote, white, middle-class, U.S. Christian feminist social ethicist, end quote, and that her research and advocacy has been an analysis of and a response to economic globalization, her writing seemed more generalized than specific. And that's not a criticism. It's just that it did not strike me as being from a strictly feminist position. But as I said earlier, I particularly liked Brubaker's analysis of neoliberalism. And this morning, I read an interview in Truth Out from April 1st, a few days ago, entitled Chomsky, Ventilator Shortage Exposes the Cruelty of Neoliberal Capitalism. I can't think of a more powerful indicator of how both readings we did for this week contribute to other insights we've gained in these past weeks and the overall goals of this course.